Hey everyone, my name is Rich. Thanks for checking out this video about the Lock and Load Tactical Game System. You may or may not be aware that there's a Lock and Load Tactical Starter Kit, which provides a low-cost, straightforward access point for someone who wants to try out the game system and see if it's for them. The starter kit includes 4 scenarios, 2 of which are set in World War II and are from the Heroes of Normandy module, while the other 2 are set in Vietnam and are from the Heroes of the Nam module. I thought for this video I'd do a playthrough/tutorial of one of the Vietnam scenarios, the weapons cache. Let's take a look at the scenario information. In Lock and Load Tactical, all scenarios are laid out in a similar format with specific sections. The scenario's title is at the top of the first page. Under the title is the date and location, followed by the scenario description. Here we see the scenario takes place in August 1965, and that historically, Operation Cutlass was a search and destroy mission conducted by the 1st Brigade, 101st Airborne Division. In this hypothetical situation, a U.S. platoon is dispatched on the second day of the operation to destroy a weapons cache in a village. Unbeknownst to the Americans, the village is the logistics and resupply point for a local Viet Cong force. All right, the next section is the orders of battle for each side. Listed is their historical formations, if applicable, and where they set up, and or where and when they enter the map. Which side sets up first is also indicated. Here we see the Americans set up in or within 1 hex of J8 on map 1. They have 3 squads, 2 support weapons, 1 medic, and 1 leader. The VC, we are told, will set up as per special scenario rule number 1, which we'll look at in a moment. And they'll have 3 squads, a sniper, and 1 leader. The next section is Scenario Essentials. Scenario Essentials include the playable area, and we'll be using map 1. Scenario Length, which here is 6 turns, and the American player has the initiative on turn 1. And last but not least, the victory conditions, which are just what they sound like. They're what one side or the other has to accomplish in order to claim victory. Here, to win, the American player must find and destroy the weapons cache and control hexes L3 and M3 by the end of the scenario. Any other outcome results in a Viet Cong victory. Special Scenario Rules is the next section. Here there are 2. The first tells us the VC don't set up on the map, but their deployment hinges on the event markers that are going to be placed on the map. More on event markers in just a moment. But the second SSR pertains to optional hero creation in the scenario. And shoot, let's go ahead and include the possibility of heroes being created during the course of play. So when/if that comes up, we'll walk through what happens, okay? Event markers is the next section. They're placed during setup. The event marker or markers are specified by letter and type, either occupation or line of sight, and its hex placement is listed. Events are usually activated by one side, and that side is listed as well. When activated, a specific paragraph must be read, and that's also listed. Sometimes there are no events in a scenario, and so this section is left out. A scenario's final section is paragraphs, which are linked to the event markers. You aren't supposed to read the paragraphs until the event markers are activated by line of sight or occupation. And the first time I played this scenario using the Lock and Load Tactical Digital games on Steam, I did actually have no idea what would happen with the event markers. If you've played a scenario before, then obviously what happens with regard to the paragraphs aren't going to surprise you. So then, if you are replaying the scenario, just treat them as conditional reinforcements. Since, spoiler alert if you're a new player, but if an event marker is activated, that's usually what's going to happen. At any rate, that's how pretty much all lock and load tactical scenarios are going to be laid out. All in this same format like we see here for the weapons cache. And FYI, but all 4 of the starter kit scenarios are available at the Lock and Load Publishing website in the online library. Let's take a look at map 1, since it will be our battleground for this scenario. Just to orient ourselves, the top of the map here is north, and we're told in the scenario information that the American units must set up in or within 1 hex of J8, which is here. The VC units aren't on the map to start the scenario, but event marker A, which will be activated by line of sight, is placed in hex K4. Event marker B, which will be activated by occupation, is placed in M3. And event marker D, which will also be activated by occupation, is placed in L3. L3 and M3 are also the 2 hexes that the Americans must control at the end of the scenario. Okay, as far as the terrain here on map 1, there are clear hexes, which include road hexes, rice paddies, kunai grass, brush, light jungle, heavy jungle, and there are also bamboo huts and a wooden building. Keep in mind that the art surrounding a hex's center dot defines the type of terrain in the hex, as well as its level. With regard to that, there's also a hill here in the southwest corner of the map, but since most of the terrain in Lock and Load Tactical, and most of the terrain here on map 1, is at ground level, or level 0, we'll only have hills and higher terrain enter our discussion if it comes up during the playthrough. In any case, games in the Lock and Load Tactical system will always have a terrain effects chart that you will want to pull up and have handy while you're playing, since the Terrain Effects Chart, the TEC, tells you everything you need to know about the terrain in that particular game. Each terrain effects chart is laid out using this same format with rows and columns. From left to right, it shows terrain images, terrain names, terrain type, either open, degrading, or blocking, movement costs for different types of units, the target modifier, in other words, the defensive bonus, obstacle height, and then there will be notes if applicable. Let's talk about the three types of terrain: open, degrading, and blocking. Open terrain hexes, such as clear or road hexes, are just that, open. They don't provide any target modifiers, in other words, no defensive bonus. They don't inhibit line of sight and are always spotted. More about spotting in a moment. Then there are degrading terrain hexes, such as brush or light jungle. These hexes degrade or hinder line of sight and aren't spotted unless units in the hex perform an action, such as firing or moving, that causes the hex to become spotted. So there's open terrain hexes, degrading terrain hexes, and there are also blocking terrain hexes, such as huts, kunai grass, and heavy jungle. These hexes block line of sight and also are not spotted unless units in them perform an action, such as firing or moving, that causes the hex to become spotted. So, what's the deal with spotting and spotted hexes? Well, first of all, there's the question of line of sight. You have to ask yourself if your unit can see the hex. If the answer to that is yes, then you can move on to the question of whether the hex is spotted or not spotted. Your unit can't fire at targets to which they don't have a line of sight, or at units and hexes that aren't spotted. And it's essential to understand that hexes and not units are spotted. No matter what you're doing right now, stand up, and while you pat your head with one hand and rub your belly with the other, spin around in a circle and repeat 3 times, hexes and not units are spotted. Hexes and not units are spotted. Hexes and not units are spotted. Go ahead. I'll wait. Okay, now that that's imprinted in your mind, the next thing to understand is that just because you, the human player, looking at the map, can see the opposing side's units, doesn't mean that your cardboard counters on the map can see the enemy units. Even if your unit has a line of sight to the target hex, it may not be able to see the enemy units within the hex, because the hex has to be spotted. Think of spotting in terms of a hex having activity within it that alerts your units to the presence of the enemy. And for example, that activity might be units firing or moving. All right, so here we'll use this American squad in H4 and a number of Viet Cong squads to illustrate the principles of spotting. Let's say it's the American player's impulse, And with this VC squad in D4, the hex is spotted because it's open terrain. It's not necessary, but here for illustrative purposes, we can mark this hex with a spotted counter. So hex D4 is spotted simply because it's open terrain. However, degrading and blocking terrain is another matter. Again, let's say it's the American player's impulse, and we have this VC squad in the hut in K4. It hasn't done anything. It's not marked with a fired or a moved counter, so the hex is not spotted. Spotted? No. But now, let's say it's the VC player's impulse. If the VC squad in F3 in the kunai grass fires, and the hex is marked with a fired counter, that means the hex is therefore spotted. Again, it's not necessary since the fired marker means the hex is spotted, but for illustrative purposes, we'll place a spotted counter on F3. Next, if the VC squad here low crawls into the brush hex in F5, then F5 isn't spotted. What's low crawl? Well, low crawl is when a multi-man counter or single-man counter spends its entire impulse to move one hex. And low crawling units don't create a spotted hex during their movement, provided they don't find themselves in an otherwise spotted hex, such as open terrain. So, spotted? No. Then, the VC squad in I5 will use regular movement to move into hex J5. We'll put the other squad on top since it didn't move. There we go. So the VC squad moves into J5, perhaps on its way to the hut in K4. But when it moves into J5, then J5 becomes spotted. And again, since hexes rather than units are spotted, if one unit in a hex performs an action that causes the hex to be spotted, then all units in the hex can be fired at. So for example, here with hex J5 spotted, the American squad could fire on it, with the results affecting both the moving VC squad and also the VC squad that didn't move, but is just an innocent bystander, crouching there in the light jungle. Note, though, that here, if the American squad does opportunity fire on hex J5, then it would roll 1d6 and add 3. That 3 is its inherent firepower of 2, plus 1 for firing on a moving unit. So it would roll 1d6 and add 3 against the moving VC squad, but only add its inherent firepower of 2 against the stationary VC squad. So basically the American squad would use the same die roll to make 2 separate attacks. And for their die roll, both the moving VC squad and the stationary one would receive the +2 target modifier for Viet Cong units being in a light jungle hex. So they'd roll 1d6, just one roll for both, and add that 2 for being in a light jungle hex. Okay, then 2 more things to point out. First, a good order friendly unit automatically spots all 6 adjacent hexes. So that means no matter what the VC squad in hex M2 does or doesn't do, the American squad next door automatically spots hex M2 simply because it's adjacent. Then, the other thing to point out is that good order units can attempt to spot unspotted hexes to which they have a line of sight. So, the American squad in N5 could attempt to spot the VC squad in N7. Spotting attempts are made by rolling 1d6. Blocking terrain hexes are successfully spotted with a die roll of 2 or less. Degrading terrain hexes are spotted on a die roll of 3 or less. So here, since the VC squad is in a heavy jungle hex, which is blocking terrain, the American squad would need to roll a 2 or less to successfully spot that hex. All right, those are the basics of spotting. There's actually quite a bit more we could talk about with regard to spotted hexes and spotting, but rather than get too far off into the weeds, I think with covering the basics, we'll call it good. And if/when any of those other details comes up during the playthrough, we'll just cover it then. So here, before moving on, we'll let the last word be, remember, hexes, not units, are spotted. All right, we've looked at the map and talked about terrain. We've had a little discussion about spotting. Now, let's look at the American and Viet Cong units we'll be using to play this scenario. Each side has multi-man counters in the form of squads. Squads represent 8 to 12 men, and there are 2 figures on the counter. Across the bottom of a multi-man counter, from left to right, is their inherent firepower, range, and movement factor. Their morale rating is in a circle in the upper right corner. Inherent firepower is a unit's basic firepower without the addition of any support weapons. The inherent firepower number is added to direct fire attacks. Range is how many hexes the unit can fire with its inherent firepower, and you count the target hex but not the firing unit's hex. Movement factor is the number of movement points a unit can spend during an impulse. And morale is a general measure of a unit's willingness to fight. The front of a unit's counter is its good order side, while the back of it is the shaken side. Shaken multi-man counters lose their inherent firepower and so cannot fire, which explains why there's also no range, and their movement factor is reduced, usually by half. The American squad here would be referred to as a 264 or a 264-5 to include its morale. The VC squad is a 143 or a 143-4 to include its morale. Both sides in this scenario also have single-man counters in the form of a leader and a medic for the Americans, and a leader and a sniper for the VC. In the lock and load tactical system, single-man counters represent significant individuals that have the power to affect the course of a battle. Leaders are individuals with exceptional skills. They're usually officers or outstanding NCOs, non-commissioned officers. The numbers on the right side of a leader counter are, from top to bottom, morale, leadership modifier, and movement factor. Leaders don't have an inherent firepower. Lieutenant Jensen here is referred to as a 616 leader, and Lieutenant DM is a 505 leader. The front of a leader counter is their good order side, while the back is their shaken side. You'll note that shaken leaders lose their leadership modifier, and their movement factor is usually halved. A leader's leadership modifier is a measure of his or her, since there's some tough female leaders in the game system with the VC and the Soviet partisans. But in any case, a leader's leadership modifier is a measure of his or her command ability. A good order leader's leadership modifier is added to direct fire attacks, is subtracted from damage checks by all infantry units in the hex, is subtracted from rally attempts by all shaken infantry units in the hex, and it's added to a melee die roll. With regard to a leader's movement factor, good order leaders, when stacked with and moving with a multi-man counter or counters, can initiate double time movement, which adds 2 movement points to the multi-man counter's movement factor, which is obviously a significant benefit. Then, although it's not indicated anywhere on their counter, all leaders also have a leadership range of 1. Leadership range is only used for the purpose of activation, which means a leader, in good order or shaken, can activate units in their hex and adjacent hexes during the same impulse. A wounded leader loses his or her leadership range, and so a wounded leader can only activate units in their hex, and their morale is also reduced by 1. FYI, but leadership range doesn't apply to rally attempts, so leaders can't attempt to rally units in adjacent hexes. Okay, let's take a quick look at the other single-man counters in this scenario. Medics represent exceptional medical personnel. They have no inherent firepower or range and can't fire support weapons. They can, however, use their medical skills to heal units. During each rally phase, a good order medic can either attempt to 1. Remove a wounded marker from one single man counter, including himself, or flip a wounded hero to its non-wounded side, or 2. It can try to rally a shaken multi-man counter or single-man counter to its good order side. Something to keep in mind is that medics are non-melee eligible units, which means that if there isn't a friendly multi-man counter or melee eligible single-man counter in the hex, then the medic doesn't get to engage in melee with the enemy but is eliminated. Then the VC have a sniper. Snipers are placed on the map after the scenario starts per Rule 11.4. So let's just take a look at Rule 11.4. Here we go. And with Rule 11.4, we're told that snipers have no movement factor because usually, once placed, the sniper can't move. As far as placement, that happens once the scenario starts and the owning player can place the sniper during his own impulse or during an enemy impulse when the sniper will use opportunity fire. And then it's important to remember that a sniper can only be placed in a hex with a positive target modifier. Something else to keep in mind is that snipers, like medics, are non-melee eligible units. So, if they're caught alone in a hex with an enemy unit, they don't get to engage in melee. Instead, they're eliminated. Okay, and then we'll also mention heroes. Heroes are also single-man counters. And if a hero is created during our playthrough, we'll cover their attributes in more detail. But for right now, we'll just note how a hero is created. Well, there's a chance a hero is created whenever a 1 is rolled on a squad or half squad's damage check. If that happens, you roll 1d6 again, and if the number is even, then a hero is created. If the number is odd, then no hero. Finally, we see the Americans have support weapons in the form of 2 M60 machine guns. The 2 numbers on the counter are firepower and range. A support weapon has to be possessed by a multi-man counter or eligible single-man counter in order to be fired. And a support weapon counter is placed under the unit possessing it. A squad can carry up to 2 support weapons. An eligible single-man counter can carry a support weapon, but forfeits 2 movement points while doing so. A squad can fire 1 support weapon and retain its own inherent firepower, or fire 2 support weapons and forfeit its own firepower. Eligible single-man counters can fire a support weapon, but do so at half the support weapon's firepower. And 2 eligible single-man counters can fire a support weapon without penalty, that is, at full firepower. Okay, and with that, I think we've covered everything we need to. We've covered the scenario information, the maps and terrain, spotting, and units and whatnot. So I don't think we can avoid it any longer. I think we're ready to start pushing some counters around. We'll get the Americans set up and get this party started. Okay, here we are ready to start turn 1. As you guys will recall, the scenario information told us that the Americans had to set up in hex J8 or within 1 hex of J8. So the Americans have set up in hexes J7 and K7. And obviously they've set up in 2 stacks. The rules regarding stacking would actually allow all of the Americans to set up in 1 hex, since up to 3 squads, or their equivalent, and 2 single-man counters can stack in 1 hex, but it's usually not a good idea to put all of your eggs in 1 basket, so to speak. In fact, if you're on the attack, it's usually a good idea to have at least 2 stacks. 1 will be a base of fire, which will support your other stack, which will be your maneuver element. So here, as you can see, the American player has decided to split his force into 2 stacks. 1 stack consisting of the medic and a squad with one of the M60s has set up in hex J7. They're going to move and try to establish a base of fire in hex K4. Then the second stack, consisting of Lieutenant Jensen and the other 2 squads with the other M60, has set up in hex K7, and it will be the maneuver element. aiming to move up and fulfill the victory conditions by capturing hexes L3 and M3 and hopefully finding the weapons cache in one of those hexes. As far as kicking things off, each turn in a scenario has 3 phases: a rally phase, an operations phase, and an administrative phase. At the start of a scenario, the first rally phase of the game is usually just a formality, since there's not really anything to do in the first rally phase. The scenario information told us the Americans have the initiative on the first turn, which makes sense since the VC aren't even on the map yet. And here with Vassal, we can mark the side that has the initiative on the turn track. And also, if you want, you can mark the turn track in some way, just so there's a visual reminder that the scenario is 6 turns long. In any case, let's move right along to the operations phase, the ops phase. During the operations phase, the players alternate impulses. In an impulse, one hex and all the units in it can be activated to fire, move, low crawl, or undertake any other action which the unit or units is eligible to perform. When activating a leader, units not only in the leader's hex, but also in all hexes adjacent to the leader's hex can be activated, since leaders have that inherent leadership range of 1 hex. At any rate, we mentioned players alternate impulses, and that just means the player with the initiative goes first, activating a hex or passing, since passing is always an option. But then his opponent goes, and so on, until the ops phase is over. And the ops phase is over once all activated units have either performed an action or been marked with an ops complete counter, or after 3 passes. For example, player 1 passes, player 2 passes, player 1 passes again, the ops phase ends, and the admin phase begins. All right, so here the American player will get things rolling. We'll start the first operations phase of the game by activating hex K7. And he'll also use Lieutenant Jensen's leadership range of 1 to activate hex J7. But we'll just stick a pin in J7 for now and start with K7. During an impulse, the active player can activate all or some of the units in a hex. And here, the American player will activate everyone in K7. That is, Lieutenant Jensen and both squads. Multi-man counters that begin their impulse and move the entire impulse with a good order leader can increase their movement factor by 2 using double time movement, and that's what's going to happen here. Lieutenant Jensen's presence allows the squads to use double time movement, so everyone will have 6 movement factors and will aim to end up in hex L5. So they move to hex L7, spending 2 movement points because the terrain is heavy jungle. Then they move to L6, another heavy jungle hex, and spending 2 more movement points. And after they enter L6, they can see hex K4, which immediately activates the line of sight event marker there. Now, hexes K5 and L5 are light jungle, which is degrading terrain, which hinders line of sight but doesn't block it. So yes, the Americans can see hex K4 from their present position. So that means before Lieutenant Jensen and the two squads can continue moving, we need to read the paragraph that's linked to event marker A. Okay, when event marker A is activated, we read paragraph 1. Paragraph 1 says, as the American infantrymen come in sight of the village, voices cry out an alarm. In seconds, Viet Cong insurgents begin firing from the village and the surrounding jungle at the advancing Americans. All Viet Cong units, except the sniper, are now placed in any of the following hexes. And we'll look at those hexes in just a moment when we pull the map back up. But we continue to read that the VC can immediately conduct opportunity fire, and the sniper is placed as per Rule 11.4. Okie dokie. So the VC can now be placed in any of the following hexes. K4, M3, L3, J5, I5, I3, J3, K2, L2, or M2. After mulling over his options, the VC player decides to place one squad in K4, one squad in M3, and Lieutenant DM with the third squad in L3. And he leaves the sniper off board for now. The VC player can immediately opportunity fire any of his units that are eligible to do so, which would be everyone, since for all the just placed Viet Cong, hex L6 is spotted because of the moving American units. But the VC hold their fire for now. Lieutenant Jensen and the two American squads have only used 4 of their 6 movement factors, so they continue to move now. And although they'd originally planned to go to hex L5, the sudden appearance of the VC will alter those plans, and instead they'll spend 2 movement points and end up in hex M5. And as a unit or units are moved, the owning player has to give his opponent sufficient time to declare whether or not he wants to use opportunity fire before the active player continues to move or take some other action. Here, the American player still has the units in hex J7 to move, but before he does that, the VC player declares that he'll use opportunity fire and target the American units in hex M5. So the first shots of the scenario will be fired as the VC squad in M3 will use op fire. So let's walk through what happens. The VC squad will use direct fire to attack the Americans. Direct fire is, for all intents and purposes, small arms fire. To fire at enemy units, they must be within range, within line of sight, and in a spotted hex. Here, all those boxes are checked. The VC squad's range is 4, and the Americans are just 2 hexes away. 1, 2. The line of sight is clear, although there is one degrading terrain hex in between the firing unit and the target hex, the light jungle hex. Now, 1 or 2 degrading terrain hexes are okay, but 3 such hexes blocks line of sight. So, the Americans are within range and in line of sight of the VC squad. And last, the Americans are in a spotted hex due to the movement marker. The VC squad, as the attacker, will roll 1d6, adding its 1 firepower, but subtracting 1 for the 1 degrading terrain hex through which the line of sight passes, so that +1 and -1 cancel each other out. But then 1 is added to the die roll because the Americans are moving. So the VC squad's attack will end up being a 1d6 +1. After the attacker rolls, or at the same time, the defender rolls. They roll 1d6 also, and they add the target modifier, or defensive bonus, of the hex terrain they occupy. Here the Americans will add 1 for the light jungle hex they occupy, so their die roll will also end up being a 1d6 +1. If the attacker's modified die roll is less than or equal to the defender's modified die roll, the fire has no effect. However, if the attacker's modified die roll is greater than the defender's modified die roll, each of the defending units must take a damage check by rolling 1d6, adding the difference between the attacker's die roll and the defender's die roll, and then consult the damage check table on the player aid card. If all that seems like a lot, don't let it overwhelm you. It's actually a very straightforward, simple process, and we'll walk through each step of it as it happens. First, let's roll for the VC's attack. Remember, the attack will be a 1d6 +1. The roll is 4. +1 is 5. Now, let's roll 1d6 for the defender, the Americans, and this will also be a 1d6 +1. The roll is 6. +1 is 7. The attacker's modified die roll of 5 is less than the defender's modified die roll of 7, so the fire has no effect. It's a swing and a miss. But the VC squad is marked with a fired counter. Since the Americans have expended 2 movement points entering hex M5, that means they can be subjected to 2 op fire attacks. So here the VC will make a second opportunity fire attack, using the squad in L3 this time. We again check range, line of sight, and spotted status. The range is 3. 1, 2, 3, so that's fine. Line of sight is okay, although it again passes through 1 degrading terrain hex. And of course, hex M5 is spotted. So everything being the same, this VC attack will also be 1d6 +1, and the American roll will again be 1d6 +1. Note that if Lieutenant Diem had a positive leadership modifier, like 1 instead of a 0, then for this attack the VC would get to add that 1 to their attack. But he has a 0, so leadership modifier isn't a factor. Anyway, the VC die roll is 1. 1 + 1 is 2. And that means the Americans don't even need to roll, since even if they roll a 1, 1 plus 1, that'll be 2, and so the two sides' modified rolls will be equal, which means the VC attack has no effect. We do mark the VC squad with a fired counter, though. Okay. And the VC squad, or the VC player, declines to op fire with the squad in K4. So now the American player can go to the second hex that activated this impulse. Considering his options, the American player knows that the medic and squad could low crawl into either hexes J6 or K6, and then the squad would be in a position to fire on the VC in K4 next turn. Or the Americans, the medic and squad, could move right up to either hex J5 or K5, and that would mean they would be adjacent to the VC in K4. And if they weather the VC's fire, and if the Americans again have the initiative for turn 2, then they'll be in an excellent position to overwhelm the VC squad there in K4. The American player thinks it over for a moment, and then decides to take the more aggressive approach, and will aim to end up in hex J5. So they move up to J6, spending 2 movement points. They pause a moment to give the VC a chance to declare op fire, which they decline. And then the Americans move into hex J5, spending 2 more movement points, and where the VC squad will now op fire on them. Okay, the VC roll will be 1d6 plus 1 for the squad's inherent firepower, plus 1 because the Americans are moving, and plus 2 because the Americans are adjacent. So the attack roll will be 1d6 plus 4. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea for the Americans. The Americans' die roll will be 1d6 plus 1 for the light jungle hex they occupy. All right, the VC's roll is 4 plus 4 is 8. The Americans' roll is 5 plus 1 is 6. The attacker's modified die roll is greater than the defender's modified die roll, so that's a hit, so to speak. And we can check the damage calculation table, and with the defender's die roll being 6 and the attacker's die roll being 8, we see the result is a DC plus 2, a damage check plus 2. Now the American medic and squad will take that damage check by rolling 1d6 and adding 2 and consulting the damage check table. The damage check table can produce results that range from no effect to being eliminated. The medic's roll is 5 plus 2 is 7, which is compared to its morale, which is 6. In this column, we go to die roll greater than morale, but less than 2 times morale. Then go over to this row to good order single man counter, not a hero, and find that the result is that the medic is shaken. So we'll flip him over to his shaken side. But first, let's roll for the squad. The squad's roll is 3 plus 2 is 5, which is compared to its morale, which is... Again, we check this column, this time for die roll less than or equal to morale, and on this row for good order multi-man counter, and see the result is no effect. So the medic is flipped over to his shaken side, and the VC squad is marked with a fired counter. That's the end of the American Impulse. Since all the units in both activated hexes have taken actions, that is, have moved, now it's the VC Impulse. But the only VC unit that hasn't done anything is the leader, Lieutenant DM. And the VC player isn't going to take any action with him. So the VC player passes. So that's pass number 1. Next impulse, and the American player necessarily must pass. So that's pass number 2. Next impulse, and the VC player passes again. So that's pass number 3. And the ops phase comes to an end. Now it's the administrative phase. And in the admin phase, players remove all relevant markers from the map, which here is the fired and moved markers. There we go. And once all the relevant markers have been removed, the game turn is finished. So this is the end of turn number 1. All right, we start off turn 2 with the rally phase. The first thing we'll do is determine initiative. Both players roll 1d6, higher roll wins. If the rolls are tied, then the side with the initiative last turn retains it. The American roll is 2. The VC roll is 1. So the Americans keep the initiative. We'll move the marker to turn 2. Now each side makes rally attempts. Shaken squads or half squads can attempt to rally if they are in a hex with a good order leader, but some units can self-rally, that is, attempt to rally without a leader in the hex. The only shaken unit on the map is the American medic, who can attempt to self-rally. To rally, a unit must roll equal or less than its morale with 2d6. And all units in terrain with a positive target modifier subtract 2 from their dice roll. So here, the shaken medic will roll 2d6, subtract 2 for being in a light jungle hex, and when all is said and done, his modified dice roll needs to be 6 or less. The roll is 8 minus 2 is 6, so he successfully rallies. And we'll flip him over to his good order side. Then, during the rally phase, a good order multi-man counter or single-man counter, or counters, can pick up, swap, abandon, or change the mode of support weapons, none of which is going to happen here. So we can move on to the operations phase. Since the Americans have the initiative, they go first. The American player is going to activate Hex J5 and move this squad, toting the M60 into Hex K4. And by moving into the same hex as the VC squad, the Americans initiate melee combat. Melee is close combat. It's small arms and grenades at close range. It might be hand to hand, but it's brutal, violent, and deadly. A couple of things to keep in mind. First, there's no opportunity fire against enemy units as they enter the melee hex. So here, the VC can't opportunity fire on the American squad as it enters Hex K4. Next, significantly, melee combat is considered simultaneous, so both sides get a chance to attack each other. Then, not all defending units must be attacked, but at least one must be attacked. So, for example, if there were 2 American squads that had advanced into K4, then when the VC squad makes its melee attack, it wouldn't need to attack both American squads. It could choose to attack just one of the American squads in order to better the odds. Okay, in any case, what will happen here is that we'll pull up the melee odds ratio table to determine odds ratio and kill number. To get the odds ratio, we'll total the firepower of the American squad and the M60, since it's a melee eligible support weapon. That's 2 inherent firepower for the American squad plus 2 firepower for the M60 equals 4. Then we take the firepower of the defending units, which is 1 firepower for the VC squad. And we get a 4-to-1 odds ratio. Then we go down here to get the kill number associated with 4-to-1 odds and see that that kill number will be 4. So the American player will roll 2d6, and if the roll is greater than or equal to the kill number, then the defending VC unit is eliminated. After, it also gets to make its melee attack. Let's go ahead and conduct the American melee attack by rolling 2d6. The roll is 10, which is greater than the kill number of 4, so the VC squad is eliminated. But since melee combat is simultaneous, the VC squad also gets its chance to attack the Americans. We'll go through the same process. We'll take the VC squad's inherent firepower of 1 and cross-referencing it with the Americans' firepower of 4 to come up with an odds ratio of 1-to-3. Obviously, looking at the chart, we see that odds worse than 1-to-3 are still treated as 1-to-3. In any case, then we go down here and see the kill number associated with 1-to-3 odds is 11. So the VC player will roll 2d6 and needs to roll an 11 or 12 in order to eliminate the American squad. The VC roll is 5, so nope. Alright, the VC squad is eliminated. The melee counter will stay in the hex until the admin phase, when it'll be removed. And during the rest of the ops phase, because hex K4 is marked with a melee counter, none of the other VC units can fire on the Americans there. That's the end of the American impulse. So next is a VC impulse. But the VC player passes, since right now hexes L3 and M3 are unspotted, and he'd like them to stay that way. And then when the Americans move and come closer, the VC can hit them with opportunity fire. So that's pass number 1. Next is another American impulse. And the American player basically has to decide what to do with the units in hex M5. There's an impressive amount of firepower in the hex. The American player could fire with both squads and the M60 at one or the other of the VC occupied hexes. Or he could fire with the squad in M60 and move the second squad. Or he could move everyone, perhaps low crawl into M4. Or even move into N5 and then N4 and into M3 to engage the VC squad there in melee. Well, after pondering the possibilities, the American player decides to head for hex M3 using double time movement with the aim of eliminating the VC squad there in melee. So he activates hex M5 and everyone moves into N5, spending one movement point. At which point the VC player makes a line of sight check from L3, but looking closely, it just hits the corner of a hut in M3, so the line of sight is blocked. The Americans continue rushing forward, moving into hex N4, spending 2 movement points, at which time a couple of things are going to happen. First, the VC player will bring his sniper into play. Yes, remember the VC still have their sniper. So they're going to bring it into play, placing it in hex N3. It'll immediately use opportunity fire to target the Americans scrambling through the light jungle next door in hex N4. Sniper makes a direct fire attack like any other unit, but the sniper rolls 2d6 instead of 1d6. That's right, boys and girls, 2d6. If there are multiple units in the target hex, the players randomly determine which one the sniper attacks. Here, since there are 3 American units, Lieutenant Jensen and the 2 squads, the American player will roll a die for each one. High roll is the target. Lieutenant Jensen, 4. Squad with the M60, 2. Other squad, another 2. So it's Lieutenant Jensen. The sniper will roll 2d6. There'll be +2 for the target being adjacent, and +1 because Lieutenant Jensen is moving. So the attack will end up being a 2d6 +3. Lieutenant Jensen will roll 1d6, and there'll be a +1 for the light jungle hex. The sniper's roll is 9, +3 is 12. Lieutenant Jensen's roll is 3, +1 is 4. 12 is greater than 4, so that's a hit. You'll probably notice fairly quickly that it's not really necessary to pull out this chart and reference it, since all you need to do, if the attack is successful, is take the difference between the 2 rolls, and that's the damage check number. So here, 12 minus 4 is 8, so that's a DC +8. Now this chart you'll want to keep handy. Lieutenant Jensen will roll that DC plus 8. The roll is 5 plus 8 is 13. So we compare the 13 to his morale of 6. Then we look at this column for die roll is greater than or equal to 2 times morale, but less than 3 times morale. We go over to this row for good order single man counter, not a hero, and we find that the result is Lieutenant Jensen is wounded. All right, so Lieutenant Jensen gets wounded. And he's also flipped over to his shaken side. So he has to stop movement. And then, as you guys will recall, wounded leaders have their morale, leadership modifier, and leadership range decreased by 1. And if Lieutenant Jensen is wounded again, he's eliminated. Well, that wasn't great for the Americans, but it might get worse. Because they spent 2 movement points to move into Hex N4, the VC can target them with 2 op fire attacks. So the VC squad in M3 will use op fire to attack them. The VC squad will roll 1d6. There'll be +1 for its inherent firepower, +1 because the Americans are moving, and +2 because they're adjacent. So the attack will end up being a 1d6 +4. The Americans will roll 1d6 and add 1 for the light jungle hex. The VC roll is 2 +4 is 6. The Americans' roll is 5 +1 is 6. Since the modified die rolls are equal, the attack fails. We will mark the VC squad with a fired counter. Okay, the 2 American squads can't continue with the original plan and move into Hex M3 without Lieutenant Jensen. They've only used 3 movement points, but would need to use 2 more to enter M3, which they don't have without double time movement, which went out the window with Lieutenant Jensen getting wounded/shaken. So, all of that's to say that'll be the end of the American Impulse. Next is a VC Impulse, but the VC player doesn't wish to do anything with Lieutenant Diem or the squad in L3, so he'll pass. That's pass number 1. Next is an American Impulse, but the American player doesn't wish to do anything with the medic, so he'll pass. That's pass number 2. And when it comes around to him again, the VC player passes again. That's pass number 3, and the ops phase comes to an end. That takes us to the admin phase. We'll clean up the fired, moved, and melee markers, and that's the end of turn number 2. Okay, here we are at the start of turn number 3. We begin the turn with the rally phase, and the first thing we'll do is determine initiative. American roll is 4. VC roll is also 4. And since in the event of a tie, the side with the initiative the previous turn keeps it, that means here the initiative stays with the Americans. Next, each side makes rally attempts. And since, once again, the only shaken unit on the map belongs to the Americans, that means the only rally attempt will be made by Lieutenant Jensen. Remember, because he's wounded, his morale has taken a hit and dropped from 6 to 5. So he'll roll 2d6, subtract 2 for being in terrain with a positive target modifier, and his modified roll will have to be 5 or less for him to successfully rally. His roll is 9. Minus 2 is 7. So Lieutenant Jensen fails to rally and remains shaken. Just a side note, but the American medic here in the rally phase, if he were in the same hex with Lieutenant Jensen, the medic could try to fix up Jensen and remove the wounded marker, since removing the wounded marker from a single-man counter is one of the medic's special abilities. Anyway, that's it for the rally phase, so we'll go to the ops phase. Since the Americans retain the initiative, they'll go first. The Americans have established a base of fire in Hex K4 and are itching to open fire from that spot, but the American maneuver element has run into a bit of difficulty, and that needs addressing. Because not only was Lieutenant Jensen wounded and is still shaken, but right next door there's the VC squad in M3 still confronting the Americans, and the VC sniper is lurking in Hex N3. The American player really doesn't want his stack in N4 to get hit by the sniper again. So he could move into the sniper's hex and eliminate it, which would happen automatically since snipers are non-melee eligible units. Or the American player could move the 2 squads into Hex M3 to engage the VC squad there in melee at overwhelming odds, and then the American squads couldn't be attacked this turn by the other VC, but that would mean leaving the wounded/shaken Lieutenant Jensen behind by himself and vulnerable to another sniper attack. Well, because all moving units that begin their move in the same hex and are activated in the same impulse must move together, that means the American player can't activate Hex N4 and move one squad into N3 to deal with the sniper, and move the other squad into M3 to engage the VC squad in melee. And because all firing units in a hex that are activated in the same impulse must attack the same target, that means the American player can't activate Hex N4 and use one squad to fire on the sniper, while the other squad fires on the VC squad in M3. However, not all units in an activated hex need to perform the same action, so the American player could move a squad into N3 to deal with the sniper and have the other squad fire on the VC squad next door in M3. Well, it's situations like this one and the choices involved that makes games of lock and load tactical so interesting and fun, right? Right. Okay. In any case, after assessing his options, the American player decides to activate Hex N4 and move the squad without the M60 into N3 and eliminate the VC sniper, and then fire at the VC squad in M3 with the other American squad with the M60. All right, so let's shake the tree and see what falls out. One squad moves into Hex N3 and place a moved marker on it. And since the VC Sniper is a non-melee eligible unit, it's eliminated. The American squad has to halt and can't move any farther. In fact, a melee counter is placed in that hex. All right, now the other squad with the M60 will fire on the VC squad next door. The American squad will roll 1d6 plus 2 for its inherent firepower, plus 2 for the M60, plus 2 because the enemy is adjacent. So the attack will end up being a 1d6 plus 6. Then the VC squad will roll 1d6 plus 1 for the huts. The American roll is 5 plus 6 is 11. The VC roll is 2 plus 1 is 3. 11 is greater than 3, so that's a hit. Or I guess technically I shouldn't say it's a hit, but instead it's more correct to say the defender must now roll a damage check. But, come on, it's more fun to say it's a hit. Anyway, 11 minus 3 is 8, so it'll be a DC plus 8, a damage check plus 8. The VC squad will now roll that DC plus 8, and the roll is 2. Plus 8 is 10, which is compared to its morale of 4. So on this column, we go to die roll equal to or greater than 2 times morale, but less than 3 times morale. And on this row, we find good order multi-man counter, and we see the result is casualties. And with a casualties result, the squad is replaced with a shaken half squad. Here on Vassal, the program does that for you if you click casualties. But if you're doing it yourself, you can always look on the player aid card or in the module rules to see what half squad replaces the squad. We'll also mark the American squad as fired. Okay. All right, that's it for the American Impulse. So next is a VC Impulse. However, the VC player will pass since Lieutenant Diem and the squad in L3 are currently in an unspotted hex, and the VC player would rather things stay that way for the moment, considering the amount of firepower the Americans have over in hex K4. So that's pass number 1. Next is an American Impulse. The American player will activate hex N4 again, and Lieutenant Jensen will low crawl into hex M4. Okay. Next is a VC Impulse, and the VC player again passes, so that's pass number 1 again. Next is an American Impulse, and the medic is going to move to K5, spending 2 movement points, then to L5, spending 2 more movement points, and then to M4, spending its final 2 movement points to do so. Next is another VC Impulse, and the VC player again passes, so that is once again pass number 1. Next is another American Impulse, And the squad in K4 will attempt to spot hex L3. With the wooden building, that's a blocking terrain hex, so the American player will roll 1d6 and needs to roll a 1 or 2 to successfully spot it. If it does successfully spot the hex, it will be marked with an ops complete counter, but will be able to immediately fire on the VC there, this impulse. If the spotting attempt fails, though, it'll just be marked with an ops complete counter. Okay, the die roll is 3, so the American squad fails to spot hex L3. It's marked with that ops complete counter. Now, spotting attempts don't count as an impulse action, so the Americans could now activate another hex. But everyone else has already been activated, so the failed spotting attempt is the only activity the Americans can perform this impulse, which means it is considered a pass. Well, that was rather convoluted, but in the end, that's pass number 2. Now, since the American squad in K4 is now marked with an ops complete counter, with the next VC impulse, the VC player will activate hex L3 and fire on Lieutenant Jensen and the American medic in M4. The VC player will essentially make 2 attacks with 1 die roll. Against the medic, the VC player will roll 1d6, add 1 for its inherent firepower, and 1 for firing on a moving unit. Against Lieutenant Jensen, the VC player will use that same die roll, add the 1 for its inherent firepower, but will not add 1 for firing on a moving unit since Lieutenant Jensen low crawled into that hex. So the VC player's attack against the medic will be a 1d6 plus 2, and the VC player's attack against Lieutenant Jensen will be a 1d6 plus 1. And the Americans will roll 1d6 and add 1 for the light jungle hex. Okay, the VC roll is 4 plus 2 is 6 for the medic, and 4 plus 1 is 5 for Lieutenant Jensen. The American roll is 6 plus 1 is 7. So 5 and 6 are both less than 7, and the result of the VC attack is no effect. Lieutenant Jensen and the medic duck as a swarm of VC bullets fly overhead. Next, it's an American impulse, and the American player necessarily passes, so that's pass number 1. Next, the VC player also passes, so that's pass number 2. And just to note that although the VC player may wish he could move the Shaken Half Squad away from hex M3, like back to L3, that's simply not possible, since the Shaken Half Squad only has a movement factor of 1. At any rate, next is another American impulse, another pass, so that's pass number 3, and the ops phase comes to an end. During the admin phase, we'll clean up the relevant markers, and that brings us to the end of turn number 3. All right, here we are at the start of turn number 4. We begin the turn with the rally phase, and the first thing we do is determine initiative. American roll 2. VC roll 5. So the initiative goes to the VC. There we go. Now each side makes rally attempts. However, the shaken VC half squad isn't able to try to rally since it's not in the same hex as a good order leader. So that means the only rally attempt will, once again, be made by Lieutenant Jensen. We'll just remind ourselves that, with being wounded, his morale has taken a hit and dropped from 6 to 5. So he'll roll 2d6, subtract 2 for being in terrain with a positive target modifier, and his modified roll will have to be 5 or less for him to successfully rally. His roll is 3. Minus 2 is 1, so Lieutenant Jensen rallies. He is still wounded, though, but the American medic is going to try to heal him. To do so, the medic will roll 2d6 and must pass a morale check. If the medic passes his morale check, Lieutenant Jensen is healed and will lose the wounded marker. 2 will be subtracted from the medic's dice roll since he's in terrain with a positive target modifier, and the roll is 5. Minus 2 is 3, which is compared to the medic's morale of 6, and the attempt to heal Lieutenant Jensen is successful. Okay, that's it for the rally phase, so we'll move to the ops phase. Since the VC have the initiative, they'll go first, but the VC player will pass, so that's pass number 1. Next is an American impulse, and the American player will activate hex N4 and move that squad into M3. The VC half squad there is a non-melee eligible unit because it's shaken, so it's eliminated. We'll mark the American squad with moved and melee counters. And we'll check the paragraph that's linked to event marker B and see what it says. So with event marker B, we read paragraph 2. And paragraph 2 says, when the Americans enter one of the huts, they find stacks of explosives and weapons, enough to equip at least a company of Viet Cong guerrillas. To destroy the weapons cache, a good order multi-man counter, and Lieutenant Jensen must occupy the hex for 1 turn after the cache is discovered. They cannot conduct any other actions. If either is shaken or eliminated, or if they are engaged in melee during the turn they are attempting to destroy it, the cache remains intact. All right. 1 turn isn't clearly defined, but I'm going to say it's a complete turn from rally phase to admin phase. Okay, and with that, we'll go back to the map. All right. Next is another VC impulse, but the VC player passes again, so that's pass number 1 again. Next is an American impulse, and the American player would like to activate hex M4 and move Lieutenant Jensen into M3, but since he's a leader who doesn't possess a melee eligible support weapon, he's considered a non-melee eligible unit, and as such, the only way he can enter a melee is if he's accompanying a melee-eligible unit. And since there's no melee-eligible unit in hex M4 for him to accompany into M3, he's out of luck, which means he'll have to wait until the next turn to enter hex M3. All right, so instead, this impulse, the American player will activate hex N3 and have the squad there low crawl into M2. And the VC player declares that he'll use op fire to attack it there, using the VC squad in L3, of course. The VC player will roll 1d6, add 1 for the squad's inherent firepower, and add 2 for the enemy being adjacent, but it won't get the +1 for firing at a moving unit since the American squad low crawled into the hex. So the attack will end up being a 1d6 +3. The American player will roll 1d6 +1 for the light jungle hex. The VC roll is 6 +3 is 9. The American roll is 6 +1 is 7. 9 is greater than 7, so that's a hit. The difference between the modified die rolls is 2, so that means the American squad will take a damage check +2. The DC die roll is 2 +2 is 4, which is compared to the squad's morale of 6, so the result is no effect. All right, we'll mark the VC squad with a fired counter. That's the end of the American impulse. So next is a VC impulse. The VC player passes, so that's pass number 1 again. With the next American impulse, the American player will activate hex K4, and the squad there, toting its M60, will move to K3, spending 1 movement point, and then move into hex L3, spending 2 movement points for a total of 3. Okay, another melee. The American attack will be at 4-to-1 odds, and we already know the kill number associated with those odds is 4. Let's roll the American attack. 9. So the VC squad and Lieutenant DM are eliminated. But first, the VC squad gets a chance to attack. That'll be 1-4, which is resolved as 1-3 odds. And we already know the kill number associated with those odds is 11. The VC roll is 7, so they fail to eliminate the American squad. All right, the VC are eliminated. The squad and Lieutenant DM. There we go. And now we'll check the paragraph that's linked to event marker D and see what it says. So with event marker D, we read paragraph 3. And paragraph 3 says, after clearing the building, the Americans find an intact and operating radio set. A voice is speaking urgently in Vietnamese to the now deceased radio operator. On the next turn, NVA reinforcements composed of 2 squads, 2 machine guns, and a leader arrive via hex H1 under control of the Viet Cong player. Okay, so the next turn, turn number 5, Those NVA units will enter the map by way of hex H1. All right, let's remove event marker D. There we go. And just to orient ourselves to where the NVA units will be entering the map, up here is hex H1. All right. As far as impulses for the rest of the turn, since there aren't any more VC units and the only American units still eligible to be activated and perform an action are Lieutenant Jensen and the medic, the American player can move them if he wishes, and then the ops phase will be over. The American player does want to move the medic, so it will go to N4, spending 2 movement points, to N3, spending 2 more movement points, and to M2, spending its last 2 movement points. And that's the end of the ops phase. During the admin phase, we'll remove all the relevant markers. And that's the end of turn number 4. All right, here we are at the start of turn number 5. We begin the turn with the rally phase, and the first thing we do is determine initiative. American roll is 3. VC roll is 5, so the initiative stays with the VC. Okay. There's no rallying to be done, so we'll move right along to the ops phase. First, let's take a moment to look at the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army units that will be entering play this turn. Unlike the just wiped out VC, who were militia or guerrillas, these NVA are regular infantry. And as you check out their ratings, you'll notice that unlike the rather fragile VC, the NVA are capable of standing toe-to-toe with the Americans in a firefight. Here we see the NVA leader, Lieutenant Van Du, is a 716. So with a morale of 7 and a leadership modifier of 1, he'll be the best leader on the map. Then the NVA squads are 254s, so basically equivalent to an American squad, except their range is 1 less than an American squad's. But the NVA squad's movement factor is in a red box, which means it's capable of assault movement and assault fire. What does that mean? Well, units that assault move can spend up to half their movement factor, modified by double time movement if applicable, and then fire in that same impulse or a later impulse, including 2 opportunity fire. However, 2 is subtracted from the total attacking firepower of units using assault movement. Assault fire is basically the flip side of that coin. A player declares a unit is using assault fire, and this allows the units to fire before they move up to half their movement factor, modified by double time movement if applicable. The fire is modified the same as for assault movement, that is 2 is subtracted from the total firepower. And then it's important to note that units using assault fire must both fire and move in the same impulse. Alright, so as you can tell, their ability to use assault movement and assault fire makes these NVA squads some very tough customers. And last but not least, the NVA get 2 RPD machine guns. Okay. So for the Americans, the entry of these NVA units obviously causes some concern. Remember, to win the scenario, the Americans have to control hexes L3 and M3, and they have to destroy the weapons cache. They currently control hexes L3 and M3, but they still need to destroy the weapons cache, which will require Lieutenant Jensen and one squad to occupy hex M3 for one entire turn. One entire turn in which they just have to sit there, not taking any actions. And if one or the other, or both, are shaken or eliminated, or if they're engaged in melee during that turn, then the weapons cache remains intact. So Lieutenant Jensen will move into hex M3 this turn, turn number 5, but then he and the squad will have to spend the entirety of turn number 6, the last game turn, holding down the fort there, not doing anything else, and not becoming shaken, getting eliminated, or engaged in melee. And the American player will obviously also have to retain control of hex L3. So that means the VC player will have to use these NVA to prevent the Americans from fulfilling those victory conditions. That is, the NVA player will either have to capture hex L3, or, with regard to Lieutenant Jensen and the squad in M3, will have to shake them, eliminate one or both, or get to M3 and engage them in melee. All right. This should be interesting. Let's see what happens. And just FYI, but these last 2 turns, instead of continuing to refer to the VC player, I'll just say the NVA player. Okay. The NVA have the initiative, and the NVA player must decide how he wants to play this turn and the next turn. He's going to bring one squad on first and move it to J1, aiming to use assault movement next turn to go to K1, where it will attack hex M3, although the odds won't be great, since there'll be -2 for assault movement and -1 for the light jungle degrading terrain hex, and the Americans will have +1 for the huts. But in any case, that will just be a secondary effort, since for his main effort, he's going to rely on pure firepower to shoot up hex M3 on the last turn. So the NVA player this turn will bring on Lieutenant Van Du and the other 2 squads with the 2 MGs and move down here to I3, from which point they'll shoot up M3 on turn 6. The NVA player's biggest worry is actually smoke. The Americans can lay smoke on a die roll of 3 or less, and smoke is blocking terrain. So if the Americans can pop smoke in the right spot and block the NVA stack's line of sight to M3, that'll throw a major wrench in their plan. Well, at any rate, the NVA player will kick things off by bringing that one squad onto the map, spending 1 movement point to move to hex H1, then to I0, spending another movement point, and then to J1, spending its last 2 movement points. Take note that there's the light jungle degrading terrain hex, but rice paddies are open terrain, so the American squad in L3 does have line of sight to the NVA entry hex at H1, but it held its fire. Next is an American impulse, and the American player has a decision to make about how he wants to set up his defense with regard to the last turn of the game. He could leave the squad in L3 where it is and move the squad in M2 down to M3 to provide some double protection, so to speak. In case one squad breaks, the other would hopefully remain in good order so that the weapons cache could be destroyed. So the squad in L3 will stay put. The squad in M2 will move into M3, as will Lieutenant Jensen, of course. All right, the American player activates hex M4, and Jensen low crawls into M3. There we go. Next, for the NVA impulse, the NVA player will live dangerously and form a stack with everyone and the RPDs. And we'll use double time to get to hex I3. So the stack enters at H1, spending 1 movement point, and the American player declares he'll use op fire and have the squad in L3 attack them there. The American player will roll 1d6, plus 2 for the squad's inherent firepower, plus 2 for the M60, plus 1 for firing on a moving target, and then minus 1 for the 1 hex of light jungle degrading terrain. So the attack will end up being a 1d6 plus 4. The NVA player will roll 1d6, and there won't be any modifiers. All right, the American roll is 1 plus 4 is 5. The NVA roll is 4 plus 1 is 5. And the NVA player breathes a huge sigh of relief since the two rolls are equal. The result of the American attack is a miss or no effect. And the NVA stack continues dashing down the road, entering hex H2, spending 1 more movement point, going into the light jungle hex, spending 2 movement points, and finally entering hex I3, having spent all 6 movement points to get there. Next is another American impulse. And the American player will activate hex M2, and the squad there will low crawl into hex M3. There we go. The NVA player necessarily passes. Oh, we forgot to put a moved marker on those fellows, didn't we? All right. So the NVA player necessarily passes. All his units have already taken actions. So that's pass number 1. Next, the American player will activate hex M3 and have the squad there fire on the NVA over in I3. The American player will roll 1d6, plus 2 for the squad's inherent firepower, plus 2 for the M60, and plus 1 for firing on a moving target. So the attack will end up being a 1d6 plus 5. The NVA player will roll 1d6, +1 for the light jungle hex. The NVA get a defensive bonus in heavy jungle, but not light jungle. Right. The American roll is 3, +5 is 8. The NVA roll is 6, +1 is 7. 8 is greater than 7, so that's a hit, and the NVA will have to take a damage check +1. The NVA player rolls that damage check +1, leader first. 6 +1 is 7, so Lieutenant Van Du is okay, and now the squads can apply his -1 leadership modifier to their checks, which will cancel out the +1. First squad, 5, so it's okay. Second squad, another 5, so it's also okay. That's the end of the American Impulse, and when it comes around to the NVA player, he passes again, so that's pass number 1 again. The American player will then activate hex M2 and move the medic. He'll use 2 movement points to enter L2, then 2 more movement points to enter K1. I realize that move may be a bit controversial. That is putting the medic in a position like that. But since the American player realizes the NVA squad in J1 could assault move into K1 next turn and fire on hex M3, he's willing to use the medic to block that move by the NVA squad. And that, for all intents and purposes, takes us to the end of the ops phase, since every unit of both sides has performed an action of one sort or another. Next is the admin phase, so we'll delete all fired and moved counters, and that brings us to the end of the penultimate turn of the scenario. All right, here we are at the start of turn number 6, the final turn of the scenario. We begin the turn with the rally phase, and the first thing we do is determine initiative. The American roll is 3. NVA roll is 2. So the initiative goes over to the Americans. Wresting the initiative away from the NVA was crucial for the Americans, since if the NVA had kept the initiative, the NVA player could have used his first impulse to simply fire on M3 with his stack in I3. We actually haven't talked about what happens when multiple units in a hex are attacking, so let's just take a minute to do that. Well, here, first, the NVA player would identify the squad that's the quote-unquote lead unit, which fires at full inherent firepower. The second squad would only add half of its inherent firepower to the attack. Support weapons add their entire firepower to the attack. So here, that would be 2 firepower for the lead squad, plus 1 firepower for the other squad, plus 4 firepower for both RPDs, and then plus 1 for Lieutenant Van Du's leadership modifier. So that means had the NVA kept the initiative, they could have, right out of the gate, blasted hex M3 with a 1d6 plus 8 attack. And it very well could have been game over right there. But instead, since the Americans have the initiative, the American player will activate hex L3 and have the squad there attempt to place smoke in hex K3. As we said, the Americans in Heroes of the Nam have excellent smoke-laying capability, since they successfully place smoke on a die roll of 3 or less. Here, the American roll is 1. So that's a success, and we'll put a smoke counter in hex K3. And we'll mark the American squad as ops complete. That's it for the American Impulse. So now the NVA player has a choice to make. He could move so as to engage the American squad in L3 in melee and hope to capture that victory hex, but that would only be 2-to-1 odds. Or he could declare assault movement and move over here to K4. Hope he weathers the American op fire, and then the NVA stack could fire and shoot up M3, hoping to disrupt the Americans' attempt to destroy the weapons cache. Or the NVA player could make a mad rush to hex L4, hope Lieutenant Van Du and at least one squad survives the American op fire, so they could move into M3 and engage the Americans in melee. And the very fact of engaging them in melee, win or lose, would mean they'd fail to destroy the weapons cache. Or he could declare assault movement with one squad, move it to K3, use fire from there to attack hex M3, hoping to shake someone, and then he'd still have options available for Lieutenant Van Du and the other squad. Well, after thinking about it a moment, the NVA player decides to bite the bullet, activate hex I3, declare assault movement, and move everyone to J4, spending 1 movement point, then move to K4, spending 2 more movement points for a total of 3, which is half their movement factors when using double time movement. Alright, then the sequence laid out in the rules specifies that any op fire takes place before the assault moving units fire, so the American player, knowing the NVA aren't moving any further, declares he'll op fire on them there as they're in K4. And of course he'll just use the squad in M60 and M3, since Lieutenant Jensen and the other squad just have to sit there twiddling their thumbs. Alright, the American player will roll 1d6 plus 2 for the squad's inherent firepower, plus 2 for the M60, plus 1 for firing on moving units, so the American attack ends up being a 1d6 plus 5. And the NVA player will roll 1d6 plus 1 for the huts. The American roll is 2 plus 5 is 7. The NVA roll is 3 plus 1 is 4. 7 is greater than 4, so that's a hit. And the NVA will have to roll a damage check plus 3. The NVA will roll that DC plus 3 leader first. 4 plus 3 is 7, so he's okay. And now the squads can apply his -1 leadership modifier to their checks, making their checks a DC +2. First squad, 5 + 2 is 7, which is greater than its morale, but less than 2 times its morale, so it's shaken. Second squad, 2 + 2 is 4, so it's okay. So one squad is shaken. And we'll mark this American squad with a fired counter. And we'll move them to the bottom of the stack and leave Lieutenant Jensen and the other squad there on the top as they're busy destroying the weapons cache. All right, now the assault moving NVA will fire and attack the Americans over in M3. The NVA player will roll 1d6, +2 for the good order squad's inherent firepower, but -2 for using assault movement, so those actually cancel each other out. But then there's still the +2 for the RPD and +1 for the leader. So the NVA attack ends up being a 1d6 +3. The American roll will be 1d6 +1 for the Huts. The NVA roll is 5 + 3 is 8. The American roll is 6 + 1 is 7. 8 is greater than 7, so that's a hit, and the Americans will have to roll a damage check +1. The Americans will now roll that DC +1, leader first. 5 + 1 is 6, so Lieutenant Jensen is okay, and now the squads can apply his -1 leadership modifier to their checks, making them a straight up morale check. But it really all comes down to rolling for this one American squad, right? And if it rolls anything except a 6, it'll be okay. And the Americans will destroy the weapons cache and pull out a victory. The squad's roll is... oh man, I jinxed them. It's a 6. That's 1 greater than their morale, but less than 2 times their morale, so they're shaken. And we can mark the NVA with a fired counter. But this means the Americans aren't going to destroy the weapons cache, and the victory is going to go to the NVA. All right, well, you can't ask for scenario to be any more exciting than that playthrough, since it came down to that last roll on the last turn. Admittedly, the first part of the scenario is a bit of a cakewalk for the Americans, but then the second part is pretty tense once the NVA show up on the scene. You know, the lock and load folks always say they want people to play the game, not the rules, but I did strive to make as few rules mistakes as possible, since this was also supposed to be a tutorial. I'm sure a few mistakes slipped through though, so please feel free to leave a comment and rake me over the coals for any that you pick up on. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask those. Okay, hey, thanks for watching this video. I had a lot of fun making it, and I hope you enjoyed watching it.